A young mother is accused of murdering her two children, ages 4 and 1. And if that's not disturbing enough, she apparently used a Lilo and Stitch blanket to smother the kids. After all this, she wrote it down. Yeah, apparently there are handwritten confessions where she explains why she did it and how she killed the kids. So today's story takes us to Johnson City, Tennessee. That's where 28-year-old Jessica Chandler lived. She's the defendant in this case. She has two young children, 4-year-old Vista and 1-year-old Eli. And their case begins on October 29th. So it's about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and first responders get this emergency call from their father, James Chandler. He says that his kids are unresponsive. We need help, bring someone to the scene. What's going on? An emergency. So when investigators get there, they find Jessica, the mother, in the bathtub. She has cuts up and down her arms and her legs, and they later determined that they were self-inflicted. And actually, an officer testified to all of this just this month in court.
A pack of razor blades with utility knives. Saw them sitting on the edge of the bathtub.
Investigators on the scene also find some handwritten notes, and in these notes, Jessica says, yes, I intended on committing suicide, and that kind of explains those self-inflicted wounds. But the notes get even more disturbing than that. These handwritten letters that she basically laid out why she killed the kids. She says that she couldn't keep them safe and essentially confesses to all this. Again, investigators find these notes right on the scene.
He informed us that there was notes left in the residence. We located 3 notes that was taped on the cabinets as soon as you walk into the residence.
So during all this, we have police officers on the scene, paramedics, EMS, first responders, and the next part is kind of wild what happens. Jessica, again, with all of these cuts, there were razor blades, things on the scene. She attacks paramedics with a knife. She runs toward them. Eventually, they wrestle the knife away from her. They're able to take her into custody. She's taken to the hospital to be treated for those cuts on her arms and her legs. And actually now Jessica faces charges for attacking the paramedics with this knife. Meanwhile, everyone on scene is focusing on Vista and Eli, the 2 young children that were found responsive. They rush to them. Is there anything we can do? Try to perform CPR, see what they can do. And unfortunately, it's too late and both of the kids are pronounced dead. But here's where another question mark comes in, because at first, we're unclear how the kids died. So when investigators take a look at both of their bodies, there's nothing that screams an answer. There's no bruising, there's no gunshot wound, there's no knife wound, there's nothing that just really signifies this is how the kids died. So at first, investigators think that the kids were poisoned, but it's actually Jessica that explains what happened to them. On the scene, as part of the evidence, investigators collected a Lilo and Stitch blanket, and they say it was actually Jessica who pointed to this blanket and said she used this to kill her kids.
She pointed out on the property list that she used a Lilo and Stitch blanket to first suffocate Vista in her bed.
All of this was later backed by an autopsy that confirmed both children died by asphyxiation by smothering. Because of all this, Jessica now faces several charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree felony murder, 2 counts of aggravated child abuse, and then 2 counts of aggravated assault on first responders for that knife attack. In court, prosecutors asked for a high bond number. They said that Jessica could be a risk to herself or other people if she was let out. So a judge set her bond at $2 million. Now, this is another super sad story we're talking about today. And for it, we're going to bring in trial attorney Krista Ramey. And Krista, somehow I have you on for the most disturbing stories over and over again. And the reason this one really jumps out is because it's a mom who allegedly murdered her 2 kids. I mean, right from the jump, what do you make of that?
I think, the youngest child, I think, was 1 year old. I wonder about postpartum depression. And some other things that might be going on in her life. She was a young mother, 29 years old. And so it makes me think about what kind of burdens and pressures she had and how did that play a role in her, deciding to end the lives of what seems to be 2 quite perfectly normal, wonderful children that, were describing their obituary in ways that were just, you think, why? They had a perfect life. Why? So it's really almost inexplicable, other than maybe that postpartum depression.
I'm glad that you brought that up because unfortunately we have done other stories here, even on Law and Crime, about mothers who have killed their children. And oftentimes it does have to do with postpartum depression or some sort of mental health issue. And immediately that got me thinking, for her defense, could they bring up insanity or mental health history?
I don't think that in this case an insanity plea works. For insanity pleas to be effective, you have to not know right from wrong, basically. You have to believe that you are doing something that is not, illegal, that is not morally, incomprehensible. Here, you don't have that disconnect really. I think that her mental health will play a role when it comes to mitigating factors such as sentencing. It also could play a role when it comes to what is this manslaughter versus second degree murder, for instance. But it doesn't play a role, I believe, in terms of being able to provide a complete defense to the crime, such as an insanity defense would.
It does make it tough for her defense, too, that investigators actually found some notes that she had handwritten talking about basically confessing that she did this and saying she couldn't protect her kids, and that's why. Will these notes be super important if this goes to trial?
Well, they will be, and they will be admissible. They are admissions by the defendant. They're not hearsay. They are confessions, essentially. And so, yes, they will play the front and center role. I think that I would probably see a plea happening in this case. I think it would be much more compassionate for a DA to get one going, particularly after maybe doing a mental exam, which we just talked about. I mean, she confessed even to the method of which she killed these children, that it was using the Lilo and Stich blankets that I guess that they originally thought that these children must have been drugged. But she said, she tells them no, and it's with this blanket right here, this sweet little Lilo and Stitch blanket. And then it was confirmed on autopsy that was what, in fact, it was. So it is just mind blowing to me. But those confessions, completely front and center.
The Lilo and Stitch blanket is just next level with all of this. Like, when we think of that movie, it's a fun Disney movie. Ohana means family. Like, it's about family and trusting each other and loving each other. And then for something so pure to be used to murder these kids is, you said at the beginning of the interview, inexplicable. I just can't even imagine it. But you're right. She did point this out, this blanket, to the first responders there and kind of confessed to it. So what about their witness testimony? Could that be super important too?
Yeah, it all will play a role because that goes to how they found the notes, how it was discovered, whether or not the defense is able to suppress those notes for any reason, were they the result of an unlawful search and seizure, for instance. So yes, and as a preliminary matter, what she told them and how they discovered that these notes existed and that the method of the killing was this blanket. That will all be part of that kind of preliminary foundational requirements to show that this was not an illegal search and seizure that was done by the paramedics.
There's another issue that happened when the paramedics, first responders arrived too, is that she apparently ran at them with a knife, like attacking these people who were there to help. What about all of that? I know she's charged for that too. What do you make of that part of it?
Yeah, that is going to be an interesting element to it. Why did she do that? I think that I immediately think as a lawyer, is there some kind of defense to that, defense of self or others? Someone's coming into your home, you immediately charge at them with a knife, potentially. But, quite honestly, I think that it's, probably attempted murder, attempted manslaughter charges that will be brought against her for that as well. I think it also goes to the mitigating factors that we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation, though, and her mental health and what kind of state of mind that she may have been in at that time, and what role did that play in all of her decision making that day.
How do we figure out what her state of mind was at the time? I mean, if she had like a journal, that would be awesome to go through and see what she was all about, but not everyone keeps journals. Would they look through her text messages or talk to people she knew? What kind of investigation would that look like?
Well, they do all of those things. That's very good, Sierra. They absolutely look at her phone messages. They talk to her friends and talk about how she was doing or feeling. Was she missing work? all of that plays a role, but most importantly is a court-ordered mental examination that will take place, where there will be actual psychological testing that will be done, and that will really be able to delve into what she was thinking and feeling and what her condition is now, in fact, as well.
I know we talked about the blanket, but I have to go right back to it because when I'm thinking of this case, that's what I'm picturing in my mind. I can see Lilo and Stitch so clearly. I mean, we all can. So I just keep going back to all of that and the way that she allegedly killed them with this strangling method. What do you make of that? I mean, it's not like she drowned them like Andrea Yates or Lindsay Clancy, for instance, choked her children allegedly with exercise bands. But this woman decided to choke them with a blanket. Is that something the prosecutors would highlight?
I think all of these methods you talk about, they're just so personal, where you're doing something to your child until they take their last breath. I think it goes to, if I'm the prosecutor, kind of the opposite side of using that mental defect as a mitigating factor to get you lighter sentencing or manslaughter. As a prosecutor, I'm looking at that thinking, this takes a lot of deliberate intent. It takes a lot of, you have to hold a child down who would undoubtedly be fighting to get away instinctively, to preserve their own lives. This child is not submitting to get suffocated. So that goes to having that, in the law we call it mens rea, that mental state of I'm going to kill my child now, and holding that blanket down on top of them in order to affect that is just particularly heinous.
The way that you described that, I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right. It would have to be consecutively one after another. And it's not instantaneous like a gunshot or something. And to imagine these kids fighting back as they're being choked by their own mother is just almost too horrible to even believe. If she doesn't go the route of a plea deal, which we can talk about in a second, but let's say she doesn't and she does jury trial, what sort of defense would she bring? Because you mentioned we couldn't do insanity likely. They would probably highlight her mental health issues, but what else do you think her team would bring?
Well, I think that her defense attorneys will certainly try to bring up insanity as a defense. I would, hire the right experts and try to make sure that, we're thoroughly exploring that possibility. And if it is viable, that I am, making the appropriate disclosures and motions in advance to say, hey, we're going to be doing this, then the prosecution will get their crack at her as well for a court order mental exam. I'm looking at any ways to mitigate it. What was going on in her life? Was there problems in her marriage? Was there problems in her personal life? What was playing a role in putting that kind of pressure on her to make these decisions? And that is only going to mitigating factors. Changing something from, it's not going to change it to, getting her off, but it may bring a jury down to manslaughter versus second degree. The bigger problem with that for the defense attorneys is going to be what we just talked about with what the prosecution is going to be arguing, and what I would be arguing as someone who protects and advocates for children is the deliberate nature of this, the type of dedication to the crime that is being done by this woman, killing one child after the other and holding those children down using, maybe someone's favorite blankie. It's going to be really very difficult to get that mitigating down to a manslaughter, I think.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you specifically today is because you do great work in victim advocacy or victims' rights. And it kind of gets me thinking, because we have talked about cases like this in the past, unfortunately. It's not a pattern, it's not that prevalent, but I've done at least a dozen stories like this here at Law&Crime. So it does happen. Are there any red flags or signs that people should be looking out for to prevent a tragedy like this?
I think that there always are red flags, and particularly with younger mothers with financial stress, with, raising two children close in age at only 29 years old. There were definitely people in her life that probably saw signs of, struggle and depression and anxiety. And she might not have been able to articulate it, but there always are red flags that are happening. And people will inadvertently say things like, I just want to kill my children. They don't really mean that, in those frustrating moments. But look at the bigger picture. When someone's saying something that I think that a lot of mothers say, I could kill my children right now. And they're saying it kind of hyperbolically to express frustration at a child misbehaving. But when taken together with, is she just having seasonal depression, or has this been going on ever since her second child was born? Is she not bathing? Is she not taking care of herself? Are the children not being taken care of or fed? And you have to look for all of those signs and not be afraid to call Child Protective Services, even on a friend, because there are professionals that are trained to help and get people the help that they need and get those children out of immediate harm's way. There's dependency court. Children could be placed temporarily with a different family member until that mother is treated and helped. And then with dependency courts, they always have a mind towards getting that child back into, their home if it is at all possible. If it's not, they're going to be working in the best interest of the child to make sure that those children get placed in homes that are loving and caring, even if it means a different family member or a completely unknown family.
Bottom line, we do have to keep an eye out for our kids because they rely on us and we need to be vigilant, like what you were saying. Krista, thank you for talking about this really devastating, heartbreaking story and giving us some insights.
Thank you so much for having me again.
As we talked about right there in that interview, this is a really disturbing and heartbreaking case, but it's really nowhere near to being over. Right now, Jessica Chandler is still being held in the Washington County Jail on that $2 million bond number, and she's due back in court next month on the 31st. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.